I just wanted to wish everyone a happy Halloween, Shadowfest, uh, Kosati Sela, all of those beautiful things as we commemorate this momentous occasion, this beautiful time of year, our Holy Week. Yes, it's a Holy Week. Oh my God. But no, seriously, though, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to see this. There's nothing super special about this video other than the fact that I made it. But that I sort of wanted to start off by saying, I'm sure all of you have probably noticed a change in the name of this channel. It's one of that I've been working on for quite some time, and it also may even have ties to a podcast I may be doing in the future. If anyone's interested, please let me know. It's going to be a lot more of this, but then some other things I wanted to sort of incorporate. But the reason why I decided to, I guess, officially change it was because there were other channels that had the same name. Ew, boring! No, thank you. Not for me. So, sorry, I'm trying to make sure I behave myself with this mic. So I'm trying not to peek, but how can I not? Oh my God, splendid. But no, I wanted to wish all of you a beautiful fall, a happy season, and most importantly, a happy Halloween. So, until next time, everyone, be sure to enjoy this video on our new channel called Songs and Sorcery. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Myths and Magic. Today, I'm going to try to be as straightforward as possible. I have some errands to attend to, as well as a few, errands, but I mean, gatherings and things of that nature. During this time, it is the time of Kosati Sela, pretty much the Dark Harvest. Some of you call it Shadowfest, other people call it Halloween, Samhain, or Samhain, or whatever. Um, or Saints' Day, whatever you want to call it. It is a time where the veil between the worlds, as it is believed, is a bit thinner. There's a lot more psychic activity or spiritual activity happening around this time. And this is also a time where a lot of people sort of adopt these sort of new personas, or perhaps a different sort of identity. Some of the roots of those certain traditions can go back like several centuries, and the motivations can be from, can be something, where it's a lot more festive, something culturally speaking. Other times it could be to sort of ward off the evil spirits that sort of, try to venture into that world. Because we are heading into a more darker time of year, a lot of those energies that seem to, I think abound in the sort of dark atmospheres tend to linger on longer and tend to go farther than they could during the summer, where it was a lot lighter during most parts of the day, as well as other predators like animals that sort of, creep at night, or even, human predators that seem to creep around at night as well. So it is a time where the waters are not only being tested, but so is a person's resolve, a person's spirit, and a person's pretty much power when it comes to their, magical acumen. During this time, there's a lot of things going on. You have your festivals, but I encourage all of you to, still tread lightly, be, properly respectful of others, especially the spirits during this time. Understand which ones are your friends, living or not living, and to sort of grow in your practice. If you're having trouble sort of communicating with perhaps ancestors or any other kinds of spirits during most parts of the year, certain holidays I think shouldn't really matter, but I do believe that there are certain points of the year where it can be a bit more easier. This is a liminal time. This is when, something that is very light environment like summer is sort of giving way to fall, sort of the dying of that life. So in the dying of life, you're sort of reaching this sort of, vulnerability, this sort of liminal state within your life until you ultimately reach to the end of your life, which would be death, which is more commonly represented during winter time when life is very scarce, as well as food or anything else. If you're living in, very scarce parts of the world, things that are very isolated, things that are very, lonely, things that are very empty, of things like vegetation or other things that would normally grow during the summer. So during this time, we sort of, seek solace in accompanying others. That's why we bring a lot of importance to things like, the winter season or the winter months or things when it get colder. We're starting to, get closer to each other because we need to for warmth. It's sort of a, subconscious thing perhaps about it. You feel warmer, you feel happier with people, unless, of course, are of a different breed. But these sort of things are things to take into account. So this sort of time of year, I urge all of you to, of course, operate in safety in anything that it could be. I'll probably go into that whole tirade at the end of the video. But even practice, just be more open. This is a perfect time for it. Be a lot more open with yourself. And, maybe something a bit more than just like the living can respond to you. So over here, on this side, I have my co-host, Grimmy. I'm so happy that you came to Grimmy. What is it, Grimmy? Oh, you have a subject? According to what? Really? Something that sort of goes to what I said. And last year as well. Not last year, last episode. All right. No, I did not do that, Grimmy. That was not me, okay? No, that wasn't me. Oh my God. Really? Really? I'm talking to the hair. You remember that time when it left? It did some things I didn't mention before. Thank you very much, Grimmy. You're in deep shit, okay? We'll talk about this later. That's why it's always in my face. It wants to sort of obscure Grimmy from my point of view. I could put him this way, but then the hair magically blocks. Here we go. This is better. Not for the angle, but But I'm so happy you're here, Grimmy. I couldn't do this without you. Bless your little heart, Grimmy. You're fantastic. I love you. All right. So, Grimmy, according to Grimmy's suggestion, we're going to go into something a bit, it can be controversial to some. Will I use a lot of, historical information? No, because I don't have the time for it. And honestly, you should research yourself. But I'm going to bring some things that do have some truths to them rooted in history. Things that are perhaps can be supported by VPG, which is verified personal gnosis. And then there are many other things I could sort of go into. But if you all remember properly, how I mentioned last week, I think it was not last week, I'm sorry, last episode, how I mentioned that there are probably different types of spirits or perhaps a better spirit to work with. I think this may be a good time for it, specifically because, it is a time of year. And of course, we're pretty much close to that point where, we're like, oh, what's going to happen? And the next time I upload a video, it may or may not be in this location. I have plans. And if you are at all curious, please stay tuned. So if I, go correctly, I think I will sort of go into this sort of new thing. Will there be a title? I don't know. We'll see a post video. But I think I'm going to be talking about, I believe, the spiritual companions. Which ones are, I believe, a bit more reliable and perhaps the best spiritual companions you'll find ever, without a doubt. Yes, it could be controversial, but there's sort of, reasons to that. So I believe I was going to have a list here, perhaps, of all of the different kinds of spirits or companions one could work with. Things that sort of operate within our lifespan, things that perhaps exceed or precede our lifespan as well. Things like our ancestors preceded us. And afterwards, it can be our, descendants in the future, or perhaps it could be maybe us later on down the road. It's not really in a mostly organized box, and a lot of it can be a bit more theoretical, but that is the point of this channel. We are sort of diving into the theory of the magical. We are diving into the theory of the spiritual as well, its practical applications and not so practical applications. And this is something that's very important for all of us, even for those that don't sort of operate in magical circles, in spiritual circles as well, whether it be religion or perhaps paganistic in its origins or even in its nature. So I'm here to sort of, give you that sort of, rundown of things that I think are important, okay? So, and I do want to sort of keep this video as concise as possible, not to so many tirades or tangents, because I am prone to that, unfortunately. It just comes with the territory, Let me see if I can move this candlestick. There's a lovely candlestick. Put it this way. Just so it's not as distracting. There's sort of this weird halo effect. I'm an angel! Fallen from grace. So I think there's going to be a list here, but I sort of want to keep the last one as a bit of a surprise. So when we are sort of diving into the, magical foray, into the magical world, a lot of us have this idea that we sort of have to work with, specific types of spirits and things like that. And there are many of us that sort of come from, religious backgrounds, so sort of, didn't really tolerate that sort of line of thinking. And it could even be from people that probably had nothing to do with anything religious in any sense of the word. But they sort of, ran into a certain wall. Perhaps they have certain customs that they no longer follow. Okay. And of course, this is coming from someone that has had difficulty, admittedly so, communicating with certain types of spirits, but better in other ones, and I'll explain in a later video. Okay. But I believe when it is important to talk about this, we have to be as realistic as possible, even within our practices. Whether you are a witch, a practitioner of any kind, perhaps there's someone that's magically inclined, that perhaps does things that isn't really necessarily witchcraft at all, just something magical that seems to work. There are extremely layers to magic. There is no a single path. The crooked path is one that can bleed into so many other ones. It's like the mouth of a river. It just branches out from something. And I think a tree is a better analogy, but it is something that I think all of us need to sort of, think about when you're sort of starting this sort of journey. Everyone has their own motivations. Everyone has his own sort of, experiences, whether anecdotal or something that's sort of experimented with time and time again to a point where it's a lot more valid in their mindset. But when it comes to things like spirits, we need to understand that, spirits are people first, okay? But that's not entirely true in that aspect. You can have wild spirits as well, things like the fays or any other kinds of beasts, even things like plants, sort of. I have a sort of different theory to where our connection lies within all these beings, how it sort of came about. But is it rooted in science? Maybe not so much, but sort of similarities that I see. Will I be explaining it here? Probably not. So don't get too worked up about it. But yes, so dealing with these sort of things like spirits, it can be pretty essential to a person's craft, especially if you ally yourselves within the witch circles. However, because magic is incredibly diverse, that is not the end-all be-all, and you don't necessarily have to work with spirits if you are perhaps a magical practitioner of a different inclination. Maybe not so much witch. And though it is understood that, witches sort of operate in this sort of in-between, that doesn't necessarily have to stand for things like spirits in of that self, and the understanding of what these spirits are compared to my personal understanding. Okay? So when it comes to things like spirits, I believe the first ones I will probably talk about, just to get it away. I sort of want to sort of rate these things. I think the best ones to work with from top to bottom or from bottom to the top. Let's just talk about what I just mentioned, perhaps the Fae. Okay. I don't know if I sort of did a video on this a long time ago. There's a lot of research and there's Fae of different kinds of nations and peoples. Fae, in the most basic sense, they don't necessarily have to be fairies, but they can sort of be any type of, natural chaotic spirit that sort of resides in nature. Spirits or beings that sort of don't really act like us, but they have certain things that, we can understand. And they respond to certain things differently. They have a sort of different code of conduct, a different code of behavior. That's why it's very important to understand, what sort of fae you're working with in what part of the world or the region. Just like animals, there are different types of fae. And just like animals, they reside in different zones, different biomes, and so they react differently and according to their own environment. Things that sort of inhabit a very polar or icy terrain can perhaps be a bit more, hesitant or perhaps even pretty aggressive, depending on the scarcity of those certain things. The landscape itself has an effect on these sort of types of energies. And it is these same energies that sort of reciprocate in kind to everything else that is not sort of, up to date on how you are supposed to act. Sort of like how every household is run differently. It depends on the region and also depends upon the person who lives within the house. So when you're dealing with spirits on the outside, like the Fae, for example, you have to understand where you are operating. What sort of creatures or Fae are natural to the area and how they would sort of operate in conjunction with how the area behaves as well. If you operate in a more desert or more barren spot, the Fae or the wild or the animals is sort of, a good parallel to sort of see or understand, can be quite aggressive or can even be quite violent when it comes to, certain interactions. Not to say that the Fae are exactly in the same nature, but they sort of have those tendencies a lot more often, I believe, if they are within those certain zones. And it only comes natural, just to give you a play on words. So if you're operating in a certain area, like whether it's a barren desert or perhaps a barren icicle wasteland, you have to understand how that sort of, environment affects the emotions and affects the psychology or beliefs, the conscious mind of the spirits or the energies and the animals that dwell within it. You're not going to approach them the same way you will approach something that lives in a more bountiful area like spring or summer. These sort of energies are different. And when it comes to the fae, you have things like the Seelie and the Unseelie court. The Seelie court, this is, again, I'm not a fae expert. This is just what I sort of heard and sort of, researched a bit. The Seelie court, from my understanding in the most basic sense, are essentially the fae or the spirits that inhabit the natural forces, if that's the right way to put it, in the seasons of spring and summer. Spring and summer are times of birth, are times of life, are times of bonding and energy. All of these qualities and the things sort of come with the summer, frolicking through the forest, having, very passionate displays of affection. Things like dancing, things like music or whatever, just in a very basic sense. And you sort of, can sort of deal with those fae that incorporate all those emotions, those feelings during that time of year in a very specific manner that they can then identify. So when you are talking to someone that lives in a perpetual state of, abundant life, things birthing, things like, flowers, smells, honeys, activity, energy, you sort of have to, deal with them according to that sort of, law that sort of governs them. When it comes to things like the fae, for example, you have to be aware that they don't operate in the same manner that people do. When you're trying to make a deal with a fae, you have to set sort of ground rules if they even respect them at all. I've heard that they are quite chaotic in that aspect. They may not be the best things to sort of allow to inhabit your home, for example, if you want any sort of stability. These are wild energies. These are wild spirits. The wild itself is not necessarily contained in that same nature. There are no real walls in nature. You have things like forests or perhaps the perception of boundaries, but these spirits sort of cross through those boundaries rather easily. And so the Seelie court, when it comes to spring and summer, tend to be fae that sort of exemplify or embody the aspects of life, of passions, of everything that you can associate with spring and summer. The Unseelie are going to be the opposite. They're things like death, decay, scarcity, barren, a loss of energy. So you have to sort of deal with them in a manner that sort of befits their rules versus yours over here. The same thing if you're going to be giving offerings. You have to give offerings that they would normally have within their season, within the realm of the world that they can then, accept as payment. The same way you would go with the Unseelie. However, there could be sort of differences here. You have to give them what they're sort of used to. Now, they are spirits and they're not all the same. You can have Unseelie fae, for example, that are used to something sort of barren, and then you give them something abundant, like from summer or spring, something that's full of energy, that is otherwise something that they do lack. And they can be incredibly elated, or they can use that, and it gives them perhaps a bit more power, or perhaps, gives them something that they like. On the flip coin to that, if they mirror their environment rather well, given them something that is sort of decaying or dying, things that they are used to being around, that they can then use for whatever purposes, they will probably gladly accept that because, it breeds familiarity. And it is something that, they can, accept as payment. Now, when it comes to things like this, for example, the idea, I'm not sure whether to call it VPG, I think, which is verified personal gnosis, and this sort of idea or this statement sort of refers to a collective acceptance of a certain type of practice, which means a lot of people have done this and have had many similar results to a point where it is generally accepted as something verified. Personal gnosis is perhaps a personal thought in regards to a practice. Verified sort of accompanies that. And so when you have a verified personal gnosis, a VPG, it means that this is most likely to happen, and this is most likely the case when engaging in this sort of type of practice in response or in regards to these certain types of energies you are dealing with. Things like, well, if you want to feel a bit better, like let's say you have a cold or something else, drinking a very hot tea with perhaps lemon and ginger have been proven through time as a VPG first to sort of, help your body sort of cleanse, to properly, help empty out your nasal cavity, sort of, bring some, levity to your situation. That was first VPG, and then later on they did some scientific experiments or whatever. And there are natural things that do work, for that aspect. Maybe not in the best of ways you'd want it to, but they still do work. And so the similar manner can be done with the Fae. With the Fae, however, there's something to, I guess, keep in mind. Because they are sort of wild in nature, it is recommended you do not really accept gifts from them, because it can be seen as a way of you being indebted to them. As a, I don't want to say slave or anything like that, but you're sort of, when you are showing yourself to a wild animal that you are not dependent upon yourself, but on the wild animal itself, it is sort of a sign of dominance. I gave you this. Now you belong to me, and now now you owe me something. If you do it the other way around, that is how they interpret it, and so they sort of submit to this thing. If you're able to provide them with something that they could not do it themselves and they want it, then there's sort of a contract or an obligation upon the Fae to sort of, I guess, submit to whatever requests or things you have, because you gave it something it could otherwise not attain, or perhaps it did not have in its possession that it finds valuable. So that's sort of what you have to consider. And it can work the same way for the unseelie Fae. However, it can be a case-by-case basis. But generally speaking, that is how I sort of see or understand these sort of things in response to the Fae as a spirit. The third thing I sort of want to talk about, or perhaps maybe the next thing on my list, will probably be things like the so sort of breach away from the Fae thing. I believe let's talk about deities then. I was going to go into natural spirits, things like the genus Loci, but they can have similar things to the Fae because they sort of share that same thing. But I don't want to go too deep into it. I have to keep this video as concise as I can and be more specific. When it comes to things like the ancestors, not the ancestors, deities, for example, they are essentially beings of great and immense power that operate on a different level. However, because they are deities and because they have a higher consciousness, a higher level of understanding, they do understand human lives, how they work. Whether or not they vibe with our lives or not depends entirely upon the deity itself, whether it be a trickster, whether it be something a bit more dark affiliated when it comes to things like deity work, or something a lot more light or benevolent. You have to sort of understand which one you're dealing with. The reason why they are on this list is because there are certain deities that will flat out ignore you, not respond to your questions, or can be a little bit vague and not as specific. Many of you that sort of traveled, or dabbled in certain types of religious circles to sort of attest to this. And there are other deities that perhaps do respond, but to certain things. And the reason why I'd probably put them, I think, a bit lower is because a lot of what they can do, you can do yourself. You have as much power in this realm now versus what a deity has in a different realm, in a different part of the world and stuff. They can only help you so much. And one can argue the jurisdiction aspect, which I think I did bring up in a video, but it is something to consider when you're trying to sort of go into something a bit more spiritual. You don't necessarily need to follow a deity because it's magic. It's just things that's out here. A deity is available, and it is something that can provide you what you need, provided you pay a price. It can be something very transactional, but if you want something a bit more relationship-based, you have to show an interest in a genuine relationship. Do things just because you want to be friends, because you love how they represent your people, who they represent to you, or how they are as someone to look up to, or perhaps what sort of things they can provide you. If you want a deity that can sort of help you grow in your power, in your identity, or perhaps in your magic, or in whatever part of your life you need help in, seek out the deities that sort of align themselves with whatever you're working for, whether it be music, whether it be art, whether it be magic, whether it be something more martial, like war or battle or combat, or even something a bit more mathematical or statistical, things like creative, things like maths or whatever. Seek out the deities that sort of align with an aspect you want to sort of get to know, awaken within yourself, want to empower, and then you sort of go from there. The thing is that it's not always guaranteed. It requires you to do a lot to get their attention, and whether or not they actually want to even give you the light of day. They have their own motivations, they have their own reasons, but you have to understand that these are incredibly powerful beings that don't need anyone to speak for them, first of all. But they can also do what they please in some aspects. So it's something that you have to sort of keep in mind. And they may not be the most reliable spirit to work with because they're incredibly independent and they don't really necessarily need you. It's sort of charity work on their part for that, for that part of your practice. So perhaps something like that, something that can be a bit aloof, maybe not always as dependable, depending on how serious you are, depending on how you do things. And it may be something where, do I really need them? Probably not. But if you do, then you can either make it something transactional or something a bit more relationship based, and to sort of make sure you sort of fall in line with that understanding when it comes to things like deity work. There's one that I'm probably communicating a bit more, and I sort of, and this deity embodies a lot of aspects that I identify with. I'm very close in personality, I believe, to the certain deity. This one I'm sort of trying to communicate with, sort of feel, and I feel I might have had a few instances of an actual communication, I believe, in interaction, but it's not it's not fully there. It's not fully recognizable. There could be signs, but we could make those signs up because that's the sort of creatures we are. We can make things that sort of solidify whatever sort of biases or whatever ideas we have already, and it might not necessarily be true. But if it is, still holding out, still trying to think about sort of things, do things to show my appreciation, venerate them, show that I appreciate their character, their spirit, and hopefully that can sort of be a sort of good way in. It's sort of, I'm trying to flirt with them a bit, sort of get them to warm up to me before we have a date. It's pretty much what I'm doing. But that kind of deity I'm working with, I think sort of vibes with that, so it works in my favor rather well. This the other spirit I believe that may or may not be reliable. This could be sort of contentious as well. Besides the gods thing, can be things like ancestors. The reason why I mention ancestors is because ancestral practice, or things like worship or veneration, isn't something that is heavily practiced in many parts of modern culture society, especially when you consider the fact that a lot of it has been sort of, run by a sort of, religious organization, sort of disperse that sort of idea of thinking. The reason why as well is because human history is so varied and so chaotic. We can't exactly know our roots fully or entirely because we don't have ways of accessing it in the most specific way. We can have things like records, medical records, that can help with sort of things. But, when you consider certain events that happen, things like the slave trade as a huge example, a lot of those bloodlines and things, whether or not it was consensual, were things that were mixed. And so then it would mean that, you could have ancestors in different parts of the world. And so then which one do you go with? Whichever one that I think you vibe with a lot more within your spiritual practice, or ones that perhaps a bit closer to the culture that you, I think, are identified in now. If you are someone that, for example, has ties to perhaps indigenous cultures of maybe, Germany, but perhaps you have, like native blood, or perhaps, of America, or perhaps you have something a bit more different. You would then have to go based upon where your spiritual belief, where your sort of, energy aligns with whatever speaks to you, because you have ancestors, technically speaking, whether it was oppressive or not, from one race or from one kind of person or people to another one. And so they are technically as well as your ancestors, but you also have to consider, who your spiritual ancestors are. It doesn't have to be a person at all. It could even be animals, because we sort of came from that realm. And there are certain animals that are, with families. If you had a dog in the family or whatever, and that dog was from a family long ago, that dog can be as an ancestor because it was accepted into the clan, into the, spiritual family. It is an energy that persists within that, in that realm. So there's things like that to consider. It could even be other things. It could be like squirrels, cats. So any of those things could be ancestors because they have a mark upon them that is identical to the one your family possesses, because they were part of that group. They vibed, they ate together, they slept together, in beds or whatever, they fought together in some times of war or anything else. Their spirits have bonded, their energies have bonded, so they are essentially one in the same when it comes to the whole general thing about family or ancestors. If you don't know who your ancestors are, that could be a problem when working with ancestors. And for example, if you are perhaps a sort of type of person now, and let's say you have a certain orientation, a certain belief system that perhaps isn't what your ancestors, perhaps from a immediate family or, further back, agree with, they may not aid you at all. That's the sort of drawback. There are some ancestors that probably you don't really want to associate with, or perhaps sort of don't want to communicate with at all due to your, problematic past, or what sort of things they did in the past as well. So it's sort of a gamble as well when you're thinking about ancestors. Sometimes they're not even super responsive. Sometimes they could care less, depending on how things happened within the family's history. But if your history is sort of, very vague, your history isn't known, your history isn't kept up with, if the traditions of your families of the past isn't kept up with you, it could be entirely different from what your ancestors vibed with. You sort of have to go by then what general things were familiar to your ancestors during the time when they were alive, so that you can do that. It breeds familiarity. They can interact with it, accept it, and then they can work with that, and they can work with you. So, like I said, like gods or fays, ancestors can be another thing that perhaps be a bit problematic to deal with when you're considering spirit work. You just have to sort of know which ones you can depend upon, whether it's immediate family that you knew personally, or perhaps things in the past that, they sort of would have an issue with who you are as a person, or perhaps what you do, or what your family does now. Even when it comes to things like religion or orientation, like I mentioned before, maybe just general practices. Okay. However, and to bring the final point, I think the best spirits to work with are people. Believe it or not, people, living spirits now, are perhaps the most important, and if not the most vital and valuable and, useful spirits that are existing, period. They are spirits that you can directly interact with, communicate with, trade with. Okay, these spirits can give you things you need. They give you food, they give you water, they give you money, they give you places to live. And there are things that can be incredibly transactional. And these spirits can also do things just because they like you. You have a sort of type of relationship with them. And what I did notice, and on this point, is because there are many practitioners, many spiritual kinds, whether in this circle or other types of magical spheres, that don't know how to speak with people. But people are also spirits. They just walk around. You can interact with them. They have emotions of their own. They have thoughts of their own. They have beliefs of their own. But if you learn to communicate with them properly, if you know how to get on their good side, if you learn how to breed these sort of types of friendships, they can have long-lasting relationships, long-lasting benefits, and they can prove to even be aid in times of conflict. If you're being assaulted outside and you have a good enough rapport with the spirits that are living, as an example, they will come to your aid. They will fight them off. They will bring authorities. They will bring other spirits with a bit more power and influence to intervene in those moments of struggle and those moments of strife. So the living are perhaps the most important spirits in your life, period. Your brother, your sister, your family of any kind, your friends at work, your friends out in life, even other spiritual practitioners, as well as the spirits that you find, in the ethereal realms. The most useful and the most important and the best spirits to work with are the ones that are living their day-to-day lives right now. There are some that can be just as dangerous. The living can be incredibly dangerous, but they can be incredibly beneficial because they can provide you everything you need that an otherwise ethereal, vague spirit in the veil could provide, as well as a god or a fae. They have a different way of life. They see things as you see them. They can give you what you need, when you need it, how you need it. It is a matter of if it's possible for them, if they need help to do so, you do what you normally would do for spirits. You would give them an offering, you would give them a payment, you'd give them a method, an easier way of bringing the results you want to you. So it is important for you, as a practitioner of any kind, if you identify with being in the in-between, it means that you operate in both realms, and you have to understand how to work in both realms as well. If what you are doing now requires help or assistance of a spirit of some kind, and perhaps the one-on-one realm aren't as responsive or helpful, seek the ones you can currently come into contact with. Okay? It is important. Just because you are what you are now as a witch, as a mage, as a magician of any kind, you have to understand what works for you in the moment and to learn how to work with a spirit, whether it is living or dead. You have to learn how to speak with people. You have to sort of break out of that shell. You have to sort of, mend any sort of spiritual tears you have within your life. No more spiritual bypass. It can be difficult, but you have to be an ambassador for the living as well as for the dead. So you have to learn how to communicate in both. If you have an extreme weakness when it comes to the living realm, and only reside upon those who are dead or perhaps living in a different plane of existence, you're going to have some difficulties because you live in the living realm. So it makes sense for you to seek help and aid and to improve your standing in this living realm, to sort of, help that aspect, okay? And then on this side, to improve your relations with this side, to sort of help you empower yourself on this side as well, so that you are powerful and almighty in both planes of existence. You are a force to be reckoned with, whether living or dead, period. That is how you can empower yourself, and that is what I recommend all of you to do. I want all of you to sort of seek out Go out into the nature as well, commune with those spirits, but commune with spirits that sort of reside with either within nature or outside of it, like us. Speak to people, learn how to speak to people, develop relationships, try not to be so lonely or perhaps so reclusive. It's important to have those moments, of course, because people can be rather draining, but to not dismiss or perhaps sort of cut off a very important aspect of your life. Social interaction, friendships, romantic involvements, having, times to play around, going to concerts, enjoying what other people enjoy, building bonds and relationships that are strong in both realms are essential. And it is something that I urge all of you to have and for all of you to, sort of undergo. So that's pretty much the end of my spiel. I hope all of you enjoyed it. I hope all of you that are out there watching have sort of understood what I'm talking about. I hope it's sunk in for you. And I hope that all of you are, practicing safely, whether it is sex or magic, that you are doing your proper research, extensive research. And that's something I want to talk about in a different video, because I feel like despite whatever, I feel as though there are some practitioners that perhaps don't really explain what valid research is, what is acceptable when it comes to because whatever is acceptable to this community, because there are a lot of hacks out there that take advantage of you and your money. Okay, if somebody responds into your chat or your DMs saying that they are a healer of some kind or a reader and they want to read your whatever it is and they're asking for money, do not accept it. Okay, if they need money, they can get a job or they can have a spirit in the living room that can help them out or whatever here. Okay, you have enough problems to deal with. Just ignore it. Okay. Seek them out, not the other way around, okay? Because at least then, you have some sovereignty. And speaking of which, do not be so quick to surrender your sovereignty to anyone or anything. Remind yourself that you yourself are an individual, a person of power that also, that deserves respect, and one that is able to do things to get it in either way. Remember that there are people out there that do in fact care for you, that can be a dependable spirit in the future and in the present. Okay, but also understand that you have things to sort of work out through if that sort of area sort of feels a bit more difficult for you. Understand as well that if you have someone locked in the cage, please let them out once in a while to get some air. Can be rather gassy within the cage. And know that no matter what happens, whether in the future or whatever, think about who you are, what your strengths are, what relationships you have, and because we don't know how much time we have on this earth for whatever reason, I urge all of you to please, seek people out, make friends, bonds, relationships, make happy and good memories here, because life is incredibly short. Okay? I love all of you. I care for you. I hope all of you are having a fantastic time during this holy season, is what I call it. And that you remember that on the channel, not only are we friends, we misfits, but we are also family. I care for you all deeply. I invoke power, wisdom, and love into your lives, okay? And a little bit of edge and something else, something solid. Okay? Be safe, be well, be kind, rewind, reassess, and perform in excess kindness. Goodbye.